Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading from the One-Year Bible and examine some questions that extend our learning from the sermon on Sunday. Today I'm joined by Sheryl Daughety and Wendy Korbusieski, and we're looking at a passage from Mark chapter 8, verses 17 through 29. So verse 23 says, "What do you mean, if I can?" Jesus asked. "Anything is possible if a person believes." So earlier this week, we looked at a woman who came to Jesus asking for her daughter to be healed. In this text, a father's bringing his son to Jesus to be healed. The two situations are kind of similar, wouldn't you say?
Right. Both of these stories are very, very similar. Both of the parents are very motivated by love and some desperation involved, and they're both coming to Jesus asking for their child to be healed. And both parents are encountering obstacles. And in this case, the father is having a problem or his obstacle is that the disciples have tried to heal the boy, but they can't. They can't cast out this demon. And so he's hoping that Jesus would have the ability to be able to deliver his son. And in both cases, Jesus responds after some persistence. And both stories highlight the parents' persistent faith. And here the father says to Jesus, "I believe, but help my unbelief."
In this text, I especially took note of how we sometimes place limitations on God. And we just heard Jesus say, "What do you mean, if I can?" He seems to be insulted by this, which makes me wonder, do you think that it's sometimes easier for us to accept that God might not have the ability to do something than for us to believe that he is not going to do something?
I would rather my grandkids, and two of them are really close, to us, so they're with us all the time, believe that I wanted to do something, but it was outside of my ability, than I would for them to believe that there was something I could do, but I simply wouldn't do it. I can think of a lot of instances. A couple of weeks ago, we were off on a work trip, all of us, and their mom was with us, and she was going to have to stay. And it was the last day to sign up for camp. And they said, we were all together, and they said, "Well, you need to sign us up for camp." And she was like, "Shoo," So they immediately looked at Pop, "You're going to have to sign us up for camp." But they know that I will, right? They don't have, they have probably some misguided thoughts about what I'm capable of. But I certainly don't want them to think that I could do something and I just choose not to. And it's because we believe that God can do absolutely anything that we struggle so much when our prayers go unanswered, right? We have a different view of God. They will eventually come to understand that Pop has some limits, right? Some financial limits, some time limits, some skill limits, but we don't believe that about God. God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. There's nothing he can't do, right? And Jesus allows people to wrestle with that tension. When he says anything is possible if a person believes, he's challenging us to lean in to our relationship with God when we ask for big things. And so let's ask a hard question here. What do we do when God does not answer a prayer? What do y'all do when God doesn't answer a prayer?
Those are hard moments, and sometimes they're hard for me to reconcile, but I always have to go back and see places where God chose to say no. And so I always have to go back to Scripture. Where did he choose to say no? And understand God's character and what that revealed, and understand that his plan is always better than my plan. His thoughts are bigger than my thoughts, and that he has a purpose. And, I kind of wrote down some some examples of where he said no and what it revealed to me about his character. Like, for instance, like when Elijah asked him, "Let me die." And it's because God had a better understanding of what was to come.
Mm-hmm.
He had a better understanding that I've got some things that you got to do. So again, he sees the whole parade. We only see the one float that's sitting in front of us. He saw the whole parade. He even told Jesus no, not verbally, didn't say no, but Jesus asked specifically, "Let this cup of suffering pass."
Mm-hmm.
But he had to tell him no. And it wasn't a no because he was harsh. It was a no because he had a better plan. Because it was a no out of love. That was his character. David asked to build the temple and he told him no. He said, "No, but you can't. But I can let your son do it. I can let Solomon do it." It was a kindness to his no, because that was God's character.
Yeah, but those are still answers, though, right? I mean, they're
Right.
getting answers. What happens when you hear nothing?
When you hear nothing, it's one of those. Those trust moments, those trust things that no is nothing is still an answer. Nothing is still an answer. No answer is still an answer. Right?
Yeah. With God, sometimes it's a timing thing, and I think that's the hard part. Is his lack of answer a time? Is it a no or a not yet? And I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that. Do you have any thoughts, sir?
The scripture that came to mind is in Romans that says, "Oh, how great are God's riches and wisdom and knowledge, how impossible it is for us to understand his decisions and his ways. For who knows the Lord's thoughts? Who knows enough to give him advice?" And I think the thing that I have to remember, and I encourage other people to remember, is God's character and his faithfulness. I mean,
always.
There's a reason that when God brought the Israelites out of Egypt, that he made these decrees basically saying, "You are going to stop and remember how faithful I was in this situation." All of these festivals that they would continue to have generation after generation to recall his faithfulness, because he knows how we are. He knows we forget. And we tend to only see what's right in front of our faces, like you said about the float in the parade. And we tend to be consumed in our current circumstances as opposed to understanding the really big picture like he does. Because I can guarantee you that when those Israelites were enslaved in Egypt for hundreds of years, they were not thinking about how glorious it was going to be for people generations later to become his people and live in his freedom. But they also didn't understand that they were being protected under the Pharaoh's provision and in Egypt and multiplying to become a nation.
That's right.
At that time. So I think, again, I've given a long answer to say that I think we just have to trust him, like you said, and we have to remember his faithfulness over the long term of our life, not try to hone in on this one area where we think all of a sudden he's going to be different and his characteristics are going to change, because they're not.
Right. Is it fair to judge God's character? Like, does he love me? Does he care based on how he responds to our prayers?
You need to assess his character. I think that's part of why he gave you his word. So he could reveal himself to you. Go back and read all of these things. That's part of what his word is there for, so that he can explain to you that travel through the wilderness. He had to introduce himself to the nation of Israel while he was creating his people, to show them, reveal to them who he was, what he was all about. And that's what he does to us as we're walking through our own wilderness. He's constantly revealing to us who he is. So we get to know his character. He's constantly revealing what his character is like. I don't necessarily know to judge, but to assess, who he really is. So to judge his character. I don't know about that word, but
Right.
we need to, he wants us to evaluate his character, but it always needs to come back to the truth.
Right, which is that no matter what our requests are and his response to that request seems to be, it doesn't change his love for us and his
Right.
plan for us, and the fact that he's always working everything together for our good. And I think one of the greatest examples that I can think of is in parenthood, because you can both think of examples where you have said no to your kid and it probably crushed them temporarily. But you understood why you said no, and in the end, it was for their good. But they didn't understand that at the time. And I think that we have to remember it's the same for us, because he loves us even more than we love our children.
Yeah.
And when he tells us no, it's not because he doesn't feel like doing it. It's because he knows it's best.
Yeah, I think it's dangerous to judge God's character or even assess God's character based on our prayers. Our prayers are not always right. We're not
No.
always asking for the right
the
thing.
right things.
We're not always asking for. I mean, we can say, Lord, if it's your will, whatever.
I want a Lamborghini.
Right. I mean, Jesus prayed, if it's your will, let this cup pass from me twice. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But he accepted it and followed through. We don't often do that, right? We ask and then we just hold out, right? Now I'm not going to the cross until I hear, right? Until he says, right? I got to do something. It is easier for us to judge and assess in the rearview mirror than it is in the moment.
Agreed.
The example you gave of parenting, that child doesn't come to that understanding very quickly. It is often
you're an adult.
decades,
Right.
right?
Way
Often decades.
after the fact.
You look back and you're like, man, my parents are smart.
Yeah, now I can appreciate that.
That's right.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue our conversation around our daily Bible.